All right, everybody, let's get back to it. We're going to start with about 1776 and see where we go from there. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so we're going to talk about the Constitution because now we're talking about the American Revolution. Um, so slaves were regularly soldiers within the American Revolution. They were promised things insofar as specific kinds of rights, possibly garnered freedom, these things in order to encourage slaves to fight with America in the Revolution. There were also times where slaves were fought with Britain. Um, However, those happened less frequently. Slave labor garnered almost all of the profits that funded that war, and thus being categorized as less than human for slaves was necessary for justifying the fighting of freedom, even while enslaving others. So essentially, when they sat down to make the Constitution, the founding fathers, almost everyone in that room either had slaves themselves and or profited dearly from the market in which slave labor created. And in doing so, they had to kind of remedy this moral situation of we're enslaving people while we're writing this Constitution specifically to be free because we felt oppressed by Great Britain and the monarchy. So there's a juxtaposition there, right? And it wasn't that that juxtaposition wasn't necessarily acknowledged, because it was in a lot of their writings. They just chose this, again, religious, moral, high ground BS that allowed them to not try to feel bad for themselves or about themselves when they owned other humans while complaining about freedoms. And so, again, just a reminder, nearly half of the men who signed the Constitution owned slaves. Most of the rest of them profited from it. You have the 12 presidents who owned slaves. A reminder that while Grant is a Civil War Union hero, his wife came from a slave holding family, and he owned at least one that he freed in 1859. So, down here in this bottom picture, we're going to talk a little bit about Washington and Jefferson. Washington owned slaves and had little concern about changing slavery as he became the first president. He was one of the most wealthy men in this newly formed country, and he got that way on the profits he made from not paying slaves for their labor and for the continuing bad, egregious situations he put his slaves in. Jefferson also had a number of slaves, and so did his wife's family. It gets really hinky. He had at least 4 birds of possibly 6 children with one of his slaves, who there's a whole bunch of this really gross debate over whether or not there was an actual relationship there, and this gross rationale that she was more of a concubine as opposed to a slave, and that she entered into that with consent, and that there was actual affection or what have you. There's a whole bunch of icky there, and if you want to go down that rabbit hole, I have all sorts of resources for you. If you do not want to go down that rabbit hole, then just look over here at the bottom of your screen to this picture here. This is at the Jefferson House, and this is a picture of his descendants that came from Sally, his slave's line. And so he had one daughter with his wife, and that daughter actually ended up freeing Sally after his death because she had actually raised his other daughter. It's, again, there's a whole lot of hinky. There's a whole lot more hinky to that situation, because actually his wife and Sally were actually half sisters, because Sally's mother was Jefferson's, hold on, let me get this right, Jefferson's wife's dad's slave who he had who he raped and had did sexual violence to, which created Sally. And then Sally was gifted to Jefferson from his father-in-law when he married um, his daughter. So then the two half sisters both went to. It's really hinky. Okay, again, we can have all sorts of conversations about this if you want to, and I can give you all sorts of resources on this. But the fact that such a prominent figure, like that, so much of these relationships were tied into sexual violence, and specifically the lack of some of Jefferson's kids getting a particular privilege and position in society, and the others getting kind of shoved under rug and not really talked about much or even considered, has been an ongoing public conversation surrounding that particular estate for an extended period of time. And it's still debate, despite the fact that there are genetic links there and genetic testing that has gone back and proved some of these claims. And you can also now visit her room within the actual house when you go to Monticello. So that's interesting. And it was adjacent to his room. Again, there's a whole lot of hinky here. And if you want to move further into this, we can have lots and lots of conversations about this. But he had gross ideas of inferiority and worth of those he enslaved, including his own, the children he fathered when raping and or, because consent's going to be kind of interesting, kind of icky in this particular setting, Sally. So, and just for the record over here, you've got the founding fathers who were slaveholders and non-slaveholders. You've got your presidents over here, and I can get you several other different graphics if you are interested in that particular amount of ideology or information as well. But the South, 7%, only 7% of Southerners owned 75% of the slaves. Okay, this is again talking about that accumulation of wealth and that centralized amount of wealth that was happening for very, very few people. But they also owned public opinion, and they also shaped and molded the way in which they talked about the resources that were garnered from that slave labor and how they tied into that conversation. And because the same people that were making money off of this process were the ones who were creating the Constitution, it made it very motivating for them to protect their money. And they did so at the expense of human persons. Plain and simple. This was about the money. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave that. All right. So now we're going to get into the Civil War. We're getting there, y'all. So don't let anyone, and I put this in big bold writing intentionally, do not let anyone tell you that the Civil War was not about slavery. Ever. Full stop. That's it. Mic drop. The Civil War was about slavery, because the right that the Civil War, that the states' rights argument is about whether or not they can own other humans. Okay, it's about slavery. And more importantly, it's about the money in which they garnered from slavery and not wanting to give that up. They were less worried on both sides about the people invested in this, and they were more worried about the money. The North was worried that with slavery in the South, they got an economic advantage that did not allow the people making the most money or the high elite the same allotment of the same ability to create that economic fortitude. And so they wanted the South to not have slaves, not because of the human element. I mean, that might have been part of it, but the majority of it was based on they wanted to be able to make money at the same rate as this. And at this point, they had already put down laws and things in place that prevented them from having slaves. And so, in order to dysregulate the South's ability to make money and those people from being more wealthy than the people in the elite in the North, they had to create this moral justification of, hey, I think slavery shouldn't be a part of this. And really, all of the arguments centered around money and less around the ability to free human beings from incredible harm, torture, murder, rape, etc. Okay. So I want that to be very clear. Now, they were also feeling, both sides were feeling pressure within their own geographic regions from abolitionists and people who were actively fighting for the rights of Black slaves. Okay. Now, again, let me be very clear about this. Not all abolitionists were white. The majority of the high elite didn't much care for abolitionists, and very, very, very few of those elite people had abolitionist ideologies. Okay. And so we'll get more into this. So again, there was that concentration of wealth in the South. Very few were controlling that. The North and slavery, they profited from it too, but they wanted a system where they could profit more than the South because they wanted that economic advantage. The Civil War, many slaves fought in the Civil War thinking that they would be freed afterwards, and that they're especially fought for the Union. And many rebellions happened during the Civil War, trying to, because of the distraction of war, and because of there was so many resources being pulled in so many different directions, including law enforcement, including things of that nature. This deregulation of services that were kept as control mechanisms on slaves were allowed space for more rebellions and for more runaways, more abolitionist type activities. And so that was incredibly important as this tide was starting to turn. Many of them were forced also to defend the lands of the we're going to again put those quotes around the term masters. And that didn't always go as those masters intended, because again, you're asking people to die or die, right? So what are they going to choose? Most of the time they're going to choose, well, if I'm going to die, I'm going to do it on my terms, right? If I'm going to be pushed to the limit of my human existence, I'm going to do it on my terms. And so that ended up in a lot of runaway situations. That ended up in a lot of even some where the recruiting happened for the Union of particular slaves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So Lincoln, let's talk about Lincoln for a second. Lincoln gets championed in this country as this person that ended slavery. And while that is true, Lincoln had no ethical investment in ending slavery for the intent of freeing Black people. His intent was to, like, he was not a champion of freedom. He was not a champion of the rights of these people. He was very explicit that he did not want to get involved in this, and that he himself profited off of the economic processes or slavery that was happening in the South. He also did not believe that Black and white people were socially equal, right? That they were intellectually, socially, genetically, any of that equal, right? They were inferior in his eyes. However, the tide was turning and social messaging was changing, and abolitionists were getting somewhere, and the Union was winning, and they were winning in a way that wasn't going to allow them being able to get this victory over with and then say, oh, but we want slaves. We were really just fighting about this because we wanted slaves so that we could have the money. That wasn't going to like systemically work at this juncture in American history. And so On January 1st in 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. And in 1865, slavery was completely abolished. That, however, did not necessarily change the core rooted structural ideologies that allowed slavery to be present in the first place. And so that's kind of where we get into this. And we're going to pause for a second on slavery. We will get back to this, and we're gonna talk about also what was happening with Indigenous persons in this country. And I've got a lot of maps on here, and I'll kind of explain them in a second. But in 1830, and this was as we're winding down, and we're also dealing with how we are going to talk about or deal with slavery. We're also figuring out how, or that we want, as Americans, we want this land that Indigenous persons are on. And so we created something called the IRA, or the Indian Removal Act. And it was Andrew Jackson, and he essentially used military power to forcibly remove Indigenous persons from different areas. And this process killed so many people. But on top of that, it also annihilated multiple Indigenous groups completely, to which their histories we can't get back. We caused the extinction of massive amounts of cultures. And I can't explain how hard that is to even process, because this was what? Let's see here. Less than 300 years ago. That's not that long. That's not that long at all. And the fact that systemically these removals, these forceful assimilations, these forceful annihilations of Indigenous persons continue to this day. And we continue to shove it under the rug. And while we do shrug racism for Black Americans under the rug in a lot of ways in America, the way in which we do it over the genocide of Indigenous persons is appalling and discrediting to the harms and awful things that we have done as a country. And I'm gonna leave it there. And again, do not hear me wrong. I am not comparing genocide to slavery and saying one's worse than the other. I am saying totality, we sucked. Like white people and our forefathers and the things we did to become the country that we are right now, we did at the expense of so many human lives, and did so in a way that dehumanized them and made them othered in a way that they didn't even get looked at as human. And that's something that none of us should be okay with. So in this process, we had the Trail of Tears. Hopefully all of you have heard of that in some point in your education. But essentially that was the past. These are down here in the green, from where we took people off of the lands in which they originally inhabited and took them and threw them in what is now Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, Nebraska, the Plains area. And we put them in those places, and we consistently shrink those down too, and we poison the land that they're on. But we'll get into that in another lecture. But essentially, this is a little bit of what, just for gravity's sake, this is how many are removed, this is how many died, and these are of the 5 most common tribes, but I have a more extensive list here. Over here, you're going to talk about the loss of land, and we're going to talk about when those happened and the years in which those lands were forcibly taken. Indigenous persons were not a viable, again, source of labor. Thus, the U.S. Considered them a hindrance to their expansion and resource extractions. And so essentially murdering and or shoving them somewhere else was the next best thing to do, or the idea that they came up with. They broke so many treaties that they had with these groups in doing this, while claiming, again, that natural selection, while claiming that biological racism, that but we're they're somehow inferior, and so we should be allowed to do this. So again, they talked a lot about taking, there were two ways: natural selection through disease and extinction, and assimilation through marriage and sexual violence. So essentially, consistently using reproduction as a way to lessen the indigenous lines, and using women's bodies as a war tactic, which we will get into again later, but this was consistent throughout the genocide of indigenous persons. And it is how we have so many white people claiming that 1/32 worth of indigenous person that is in them, or I'm an 18th Cherokee, or what have you. And you hear a lot of people saying this, and I wish a lot more of that came down to, and how did that happen? Was that consensual? Likely not. And so, unless it was in much more recent history, and there's still some ick there, we'll get into this. Okay, we'll get into more of this when we get into some of the violence, but I want to keep going because we have a lot to cover. So this kind of moved us into the land of science and human difference, and really where science got mixed into all of this. And you're going to see a lot of anthropologists, psychologists, social sciences in general did an enormous amount of harm during this era in creating a tremendous amount of pseudoscience and crap that just didn't even hold up to their own scientific methods, let alone the ones that we adhere to at this point. And we'll kind of get into that. So taxonomies, or this trying to categorize people. And essentially this was, so we have taxonomies for different species of different kinds of animals. So like you'll have different kinds of primate taxonomies, and you're going to go into exactly in your anthropology class, like say you take anthropology with Freed, you're going to go in and you're going to have this taxonomies of all the different ways in which primates come down that evolutionary lines and mold out into different species. And essentially, though, the key here is that most species differentials come down to, can they biologically reproduce successfully? Not can they attempt to, but does it actually result in a successful birth that has the capacity to make it through whatever ecological system they're in. And what these particular taxonomies were trying to do was essentially specify a series of different species of human. What they failed to recognize is that those taxonomies, didn't work, right? So like they gave skin tone and physiological features. And the problem here is that, okay, so say that you had darker complexion, a more rounded nose that was maybe wider. You had maybe a more rounded jaw or a more square jaw, depending, right? Like, so the point here is that I can't even make one of those happen because we cannot attribute specific physiological features on any one type of group, especially when we talk about racial or ethnic groups. And the reason for that is that there's more variation within, and there's so many variables within those variations that create those variations in people, that if you say you want to categorize the white race, okay, you're going to have so many different versions of what a white person looks like that you can't make them all fit in one group, because there's always going to be at least one thing that doesn't work. You're not always going to have blue eyes. You're not always going to have high cheekbones. You're not always going to have pointed noses, right? You're not always going to have thin lips. You're not like, none of these categories worked because they don't make sense. Because at this point, and I just backtrack this just a tad, human evolution worked in the ways that it migrated out from Africa, and all of these different ecological pressures put on human existence in different ways created different kind of physiological features in order to adapt and work within their own ecosystems. The problem here is that so much migration happened during this process and continues to happen, that those evolutionary chains at this juncture have so many common weaved moments that you can't distinctively and genetically isolate race. Geneticists have tried. If you just have genetic code, they can give you a phenotype. They can tell you what color eyes they had. They can tell you what their hair looked like. But they can't limit you to race. And why is that? Is because there's not clear distinctions on what fits you into one race or another, because that has systemically changed, culturally changed, and has way too many physiological variables. Essentially, what we learned when we tried to make taxonomies is that people are going off what they see. They're going off the biases they want to create, and they're going to make whatever fit into those biases. Okay, that's how we make categories. And we do that intentionally to create power dynamics. So I want to be very clear. Scientific racism, or the use of science or pseudoscience to justify or reproduce racial inequality, is crap science. Okay, it's fake science. It is not science that holds up to peer review. It is not science that holds up to any kind of real hard look. And the reason for that is because scientists have spent decades and decades and decades and decades working on trying to create difference in a way that is not possible, and in a way that is only social. And those social boundaries are what cause the social consequences. But the physical, genetic, human makeup is not inherently massively distinct, and there's not clear enough to make distinct boxes based on the biases and social situations that we have created today. Does that make sense? Hopefully that makes sense. If not, and if you still have questions about this, because this is really important, please, please, please email me. Okay. A lot of these ideologies were based on that Darwinistic idea of survival of the fittest, essentially, like, obviously white people were the dominant race because we survived all this colonialistic BS. Really, what that meant was, hey, we were dirtier first, we got diseases first, and we brought them to everybody else. Congrats. And in doing that, we as white people idealized what it was to be white, what it meant, what the shape of a skull meant, whatever. And they did so in a way to try to justify their social hierarchies, okay, their power structures. And they did this by measuring skulls. They collected human skulls. They measured at Ellis Island when people were coming in from immigration. They compared humans to primates. They made unfound assumptions about brain size and skull shape, which turns out your brain is smaller if your head shape is smaller. And it has more to do with human size than it does intelligence or quotas, because the brains were functioning with the same basic premises that, like, right. So all of our brains are shaped as humans relatively the same. They have the same moving parts. They operate in fairly similar ways, right? They have the same jobs and functions within the body. Now, that's not to say that there's not neurodivergence across humans, because that's the case, but it has far less to do with race, and it the things are not connected, right? They made causation, and they made specific linear lines between assumptions they had about race and brain size, or race and skull shape, or race and intelligence and brain size. And they made these linear lines that didn't actually add up when science started being put to the test. And we'll get into that. Anthropologists like Spencer and Morton did a whole lot of measuring of the skulls, and talking about these taxonomies. Gold disproved his he disproved all of the skull science of awful is what I called it. But he disproved all this in 1977. Broca proved his own biases wrong using his science, yet he still tried to justify this. So he essentially went in with this: I'm going to find this racial divide within people, and so I'm going to do all this work to prove this. All of my data shows I'm completely off base, so I got to come up with a whole new thesis to try to justify why I'm still right. And that's essentially what he did. And it didn't fly, right? Like, it didn't fly with people who were looking at the science, and it still doesn't. And that kind of is talked about a little bit in your book. Then we get into chapter 2, and we start with intelligence tests, or IQ tests. And there's just so many ways these didn't work the way they intended, right? They were intended to quantify intelligence. But what they did was measure a certain kind of intelligence that was based on a bolstering of one particular culture as dominant, and one particular way of learning, one particular language, like one particular vocabulary, a particular means of education that required you to have access to these things in order to be considered intelligent. It did not justify, it was built to justify white supremacy, and it was a reminder for generations of Black persons and Indigenous persons were denied access to literacy and education that was even possible in this whole measuring of intelligence, right? So like, they had entire generations that didn't even have access to the information that was in this intelligence test, yet they were supposedly less intelligent because they didn't know it, which made zero sense. There was a very lack of wide range of skills or skill sets, and or cultural difference in this. And it's something we still have problems with, right? We still use similar IQ tests. We still know are culturally biased. We still use SATs, ACTs. We still use the stupid test to get you in grad school that I can't remember right now, but I remember taking it. And I remember how awful it was. We still use all these measures, right? We're using these measures even though we know they're culturally biased towards particular white ideologies. And that's a problem. It's an incredibly big problem, because it's still measuring science in these very lewd, culturally one-noted ways. And again, we're going to get into some psychologists too. Social sciences were not always great. I mean, they helped Nazis at some points. They justified a lot of really horrendous things. They did a whole lot of harm to Indigenous persons, and found ways for colonists to essentially annihilate them based on their ideologies. And they said scientists usually in first to do that. So don't hear me wrong. Not all social scientists are motivated in this way. However, social science has been used as a way to harm cultural groups and individuals on a number of occasions. So again, we talked about intelligence testing and this desire to cure feeble-mindedness, which was this idea that certain kinds of races had or were more feeble or more infant-like, and did not have the intelligence to, and that it was hereditary and somehow genetic, that they didn't have the ability to have the intelligence that maybe others did. Terman attempted to standardize the test because up until that point, intelligence tests were basically done on younger kids, but he wanted to standardize it and do it for a more wide range of audiences. Jensen rejected that there were cultural biases in the test and blamed genetics for all racial differences. And again, I've already like gone on my tangent about genetics, but again, if you want some citations and you want to research that a little more, please don't hesitate to ask. I've got all sorts of data I can get you on that. And I think there's even a couple TED Talks on it as well. I know there's at least two. So then we got some more scientists that, again, with the genetics and hereditary explanations of racial supremacy, Wade in 2014 came through and essentially claimed that that all these scientists before him were accurate and that there was a line for racial supremacy. And 140 of the world's leading geneticists signed a letter disclaiming Wade's science and essentially being like, nah, he's lying. Like straight up, we are the best geneticists in the world. Here's 140 of us to prove the point. He is not giving you accurate science. And that's saying something because 140 of the world's leading geneticists don't agree on a whole lot. Well, they agree on a lot of things, but they're not going to come to like gather and be like, we're going to all write this out. But yeah, so pseudoscience, and we're going to talk about this a lot because again, this is how you learn how to validate sources. Okay. This is how you want to critically reflect on your sources that you choose for any kind of project you do, which we will be doing in this class at some point. But just further on, as you get older and you start reading things, you start reading the news, you want to know if this is accurate and you start digging into things. These are the things you need to look for. And these are all your red flags. Okay. Extremely biased reasoning for even doing the research in the first place. Or so you're going to talk about like a company. Well, look, here's all my research on how our process is so much better for you than everybody else. Okay, right. They have an extremely biased reasoning. It's not a third party coming in and doing it. It's your company telling me that you did research to prove yourself right. That's hinky. That should raise a red flag. If the data is not replicable, which means you can't do the study more than once. If you make up data, which has happened on a number of occasions, the link between vaccines even and autism, thank you. Those links were made up data and non-replicable data. And he was later, that article that was originally stated this link has been pulled, and he actually lost his tenure track position at a university for falsifying data in order to do this. And there's been so many scientists that have disproven and actively tried to find the links there and can't find it, that we have literally spent billions on research to disprove one man's and to prove how false this one man was, that we could have likely found much more of the brain's process and why it's doing what it does and what neurodivergence means and how to have better resources for individuals with autism, instead of proving this man wrong consistently over and over again about these links to vaccines. So just for the record, that is an example of people who've made up their data. The data doesn't actually measure what it claims to be measuring. Okay, so my favorite example of this is we have a lot of science that deals with female bodies or female diseases like ovarian cancer. And the studies on whether or not like something is related to ovarian cancer will be done on men who don't have ovaries. Please explain how this is done. This is consistent. I'm not joking. I'm not making this up. This really happens. And so you have a bunch of doctors who claim male bodies as essentially the archetype or the what it means to be people. And so they make these assumptions that essentially those who have ovaries are obviously going to, like, the results of this study on male bodies are going to be the same for those who have the part that could actually get the cancer. It's I swear I'm not making this up. This stuff happens all the time. And we do this without like questioning it. We'll just take a study and we don't look into it and we don't look at what they're looking at and make sure that what they're looking at is actually measuring what they're intending to measure, right? We do this, we'd love to do this with brain science too. We love to try to prove difference. And if we can prove difference by being like, well, look, this process, somebody's using their left brain more than their right brain, or look into all those studies. It is concerning, the methodologies that are generally used in them. Also make sure your sample sizes aren't are actually fit the population. So if you're talking about an entire population of the human population and they only they only sample sized 5 people, that's not generalizable, right? Like that's not possible to get all the human variation in 5 people in order to generalize that to the entire globe, right? And so that's something that you need to look for. Also, there's a difference between something that correlates and something that is a causation. And we're going to talk about those 2 words. A correlation is, hey, so I have noticed that serial killers often have wet the bed, versus causation of anybody who wets the bed is going to be a serial killer. Because there's a difference here, right? So you're noticing that serial killers have this particular trait that is something that when you talk to a repetitive amount of serial killers, this is something that pops up, right? Versus, hey, all the people we've sampled like a ton of people who wet the bed when they were a kid, and the majority of them became serial killers, right? No one has ever proven that. Why? Because wetting the bed is not a cause. Like there's not a causal, is that a word? Causality relationship with wet, like with
Also.
being, yeah, that's what I thought. Okay. With
Sorry, my brain farted too.
So sorry, we're debating language over here. It's fine. But there's not the same, like the 2 things being present does not mean that one causes the other. Okay. However, you can link one causing the other when you start taking out the other factors, or you make your population much, much larger. So if you went out and did a massive study on bedwetters and realized that 95% of the people who wetted the bed also became serial killers when they were older, then you'd have a more strong argument than, hey, I interviewed a whole bunch of serial killers and one of the only things they had in common was that a bunch of them wet the bed, which is a fairly common thing when they're younger, right? Like, do you see the point I'm trying to make here? Hopefully. If that doesn't make sense, it's because I just got off on tangents a couple times, and you can email me and I will explain that better. Also, look for no citable sources or extremely biased sources. So if all of their sources are the Bible, probably not credible, right? If none of their sources also came from science or scientists, that's concerning, right? If all of their scientists came from one institution, also concerning, right? Like there's a way in which science has to be validated by other scientists from multiple different levels and layers and places that allows it to validate itself, right? But if you are putting it in a vacuum and only letting certain people look at it and certain people look through it, you're not allowing that science to really be tested. And that's what you want to make sure your sources are doing. You want to make sure your language, the language that's being used, is formal and not anecdotal evidence. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a place for anecdotes, right? Especially when you're talking about human experiences, or you're doing maybe an oral history project, or you're doing like there's places for people to tell their stories. And I, as a social science researcher, think interviews are the most valuable thing that we have, especially exploratory interviews where they do most of talking and you're just kind of prompting a topic and they're just going, right? But the purpose here is that I'm not going to take one interview and say, this is what the world feels about this. You're going to have to do that on a large enough population, or you're going to have to narrow down your sample size. Like, hey, if I'm doing all college students, I can't say that this is a population of the entire world, right? I can say, hey, a range of college students from a rural university in a southern state, right? This is what that population is thinking about this particular topic, right? I can generalize to the extent that it makes sense for the population, but I can't generalize that to all college students. I can't generalize that to all people of college age. I can't generalize that to all people, right? Like there's a way in which you have to acknowledge your limits in your research. If there's mention of conspiracy of any kind, it is likely not science. Full stop. Okay, just going to leave that there. We're going to sit on that for a second. But also look for the money trail. If the company that the research is being done on is funding the research, go somewhere else to find the research on that topic. Okay. Just for the record. All right. That's enough about science and its horrible things. Let's talk about more horrible things. So, we're going to talk about eugenics for a second, and then I'm going to take a break, and then we'll come back and talk about some immigration and get into some more discrimination we did for people. Because that's what this entire lecture is essentially. Okay, so let's talk about eugenics, which had its heyday in the US from 1900s to 1930s. However, it persisted until probably 60s, and you still have some that I would say follow some kind of eugenicsy like ideologies. So you're gonna say maybe your super alt-right groups, your homegrown terrorist groups, those kind of things have similar eugenicsy like feels to them and ideologies morphed into those. The eugenics movement was this idea that they could improve, big ol' air quotes, the population through controlled breeding. And by control, I mean they wanted exclusionary breeding, in the way of taking out genetic risks, trying to breed for intelligence, to breed out racial diversity, breed out alcoholism, laziness, crime, poverty, disability, mental health illnesses, or physical health illnesses. And in doing this, they ignored any environmental factors that may contribute to any of that, right? If you were disabled because you were in a car accident, you were still essentially like, hey, no, we don't want you breeding in this eugenicsy group that we have here because you're still less than, and we're going to put you over here, right? Hey, your aunt 3 tiers down that away is in a mental hospital, and so you're not allowed to breed, right? Like really not okay things. And in doing this, they forced sterilization of so many women, Black women, Indigenous women, really women of poverty, women who had any kind of mental health or disability, or any kind of health related anything, that were widowed too many times, even. I mean, like, it's really gross. This was one of the more egregious things that have happened in the 20th century. And there was a lot of egregious things that happened. Okay. So again, this also ignored random genetic variation. So like my kiddo is has a really unique genetic disorder that we've been all the way to NIH trying to figure out what it is. But I would like it was there is no connection to either of the biological parents. In this, it's just a fluke genetic variation that has been created in her, and she has particular health outcomes because of it. She, in this particular ideology, would be sterilized, even though there, and I would likely not be able to breed again because I birthed a child that has any kind of medical ailment. That's the level of ignorance and arrogance that was viewed into this, and hate. Obviously, there are ties to Nazism and Germany. Madison Grant was the prominent voice in the US, and he wrote a book that Hitler read and adhered all of his really policies and ideologies surrounding, and that was used. He used sterilization, euthanasia, gas chambers, firing squads on populations, etc. And he essentially took the primary US voice, and that's who garnered Hitler's ideologies. And that's one of the reasons why we didn't get into World War II as fast as we could have, because many in the US had very similar ideologies. And that's troubling, yes, and it's hard to think about, but it's also something that we need to kind of touch base with, because acknowledging that those ideologies existed so recently ago helps us to kind of garner where we are in history now, and the fact that those ideologies are still persisting in some capacities, and the anti-Semitic movement that is currently still very much present and alive in this country, um, is something that garners attention and garners an understanding of where its roots come from. Um, Again, it's one of the reasons it took so long for us to get into that. And as of 1948, there was a Universal Declaration of Human Rights based on the UN, and that was based on several countries coming together and really trying to form a UN, trying to form this thing to create or to stop the creation of any future world wars. And in doing so, they really had to talk through why things like eugenics and things of this nature and genocide were something that on an international level shouldn't be allowed or should have consequences. Now, the US has continued to do some of these things, and we'll get into that as we move forward. Another thing I want to talk about while we're on eugenics and while we're talking about these really harmful ideologies of this particular time period is the Tulsa Race Massacre. I live in Oklahoma currently, and it is something that I've heard the majority of Oklahoma residents not know anything about, even though they went through the school system here in Oklahoma and they know a lot about the area. This is something that was not taught in any schools. It definitely wasn't taught in my school. I didn't live in Oklahoma at that point. It definitely wasn't taught in Kentucky public education, in Lexington, or in Missouri, where I was when I graduated high school. Hopefully it is now. I doubt it though. But on May 31st in 1921, there was a thriving town in downtown Tulsa, and it was a Black community. It was considered Black Wall Street, and essentially by that it meant it was booming. It had a lot of wealth endowed into this Black community. There was a lot of prestigious churches. There was a lot of well-to-do neighborhoods. There was a lot of really promising capacity for growth and development. But with that capacity came what felt like to the white community this threat of their own way of life. And so a white mob that was sworn in by local police as special deputies due to a situation that didn't end up happening. So the story goes that a woman at a very classy establishment or workplace told some people that a Black man had assaulted her. This did not happen, and that came out later. But so a group of angry white men decided to go into this particular community to essentially, likely due to the time period, lynch this man. However, instead, they burned 40 city square blocks of a community, did a massive amount of violence to people, and the media inflamed these fears of these white people. And even though this entire city, and you've got pictures back here, and pictures of the damage, and this is what the town looked like in 1950 and before, right? This is what it looks like now. So there's been a lot of not regrowth, but essentially OSU, university that I graduated from, their Tulsa campus is now on that site. And while the school is doing some work into making sure that there is some acknowledgement of the land that they're on, there is also there's no reparations, there's no governmental assistance. In fact, the National Guard backed the attack and added to it and gave guns to the white individuals. They created internment-like centers, and between 100 and 300 plus people were killed. Again, that number is likely inaccurate, and I say that because once that happened, there were some mass graves, and then infrastructure was put over top of it. So where you see I-244 right here. It is essentially on top of where those bodies are likely buried. And there's a good portion of people that will never got back to their families, who never got proper burials, who never got justice, and whatever you want that to be. Over 10,000 were left homeless. All of the infrastructure of that community was destroyed. And the story was silenced and untold for a long period of time. And those who do tell it like to talk about it as a riot when it was not a race riot. It was a massacre. It was not two opposing forces coming to terms and coming to blows. This was white people, a mob of white men coming in to a community of color and annihilating it. And there's a YouTube here if you would like to hear the testimony of this lovely lady who was a survivor of the event, and she went and sat in front of Congress and gave testimony. But she's also done a lot of other interviews, and there's several other survivors. Most of them are gone at this point. If not all of them, I think, actually, because she's no longer with us. And in the documentary that I also assigned, there's also some testimony from her too. So there's some really good record that are coming out now, but it took 100 years for us to acknowledge at a national level that this happened. And that's something that is incredibly problematic in and of itself. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and shut this down, and we will start again here in a bit and talk about as we move into the middle of the 20th century.